Howdy. Uh, that was funny, like, one time, okay? Apollo. Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, before we begin, as always, please remember there is a Patreon for this show, for this channel, as well as for the art that I make outside of this channel. Link will be in the description section below to my Patreon, as well as to my Instagram, my blog, my website, where you can see all my fun art. Please remember, comics can be kind of, well, expensive, as can paint and ink and papers. And so, if you've got $1 a month, or if you've got even more than that, that you think this show is worth it, that my art is worth it, please, 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 anything and everything you can do to help would be immensely appreciated. So, tonight, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a history lesson. Kind of. A couple months back, I was watching the new comic book day video from a hometown shop, Ground Zero Comics. And during the video, Dave, the man who actually owns Ground Zero Comics, was talking about Tales from the Crypt, a graphic novel that I actually did a review for here on the channel before. Go ahead and check that one out. It's listed under the Dark Horse Comics playlist. And not long, or really 2 books before that, he happened to mention this one, The Secret to Superhuman Strength by Allison Bechdel. Now, the name Bechdel should probably ring a bell. No pun intended. But Bechdel has become a pretty popular name. One, because Bechdel is the woman who created a series known as, well, Dykes to Watch Out For, a really popular lesbian comic strip about, well, lesbians. It ran in various feminist and women's magazines for decades, and while Allison Bechdel was writing that, she was also working on another book by the title of Fun Home. Now, it was during Dykes to Watch Out For that she actually came up with the now famous Bechdel test, which is kind of the spurn of male comic fans and male movie fans and just males in general for some reason that as a male I'm still not entirely I still don't understand the animosity to it. Whatever the case, the name Bechdel is pretty big, largely because of the Bechdel test, but even more so is the fact that over the course of her career, she has made an impressive collection of comics. Impressive, not necessarily in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality. The woman has just brought a tremendous sense of self and being into her work and into her comics. Now, this book here is her most recent one, and I actually finished it a couple weeks back. And I had every intention of covering it for this channel. But then I realized I have been wanting to do Fun Home for ages. Which brings me back to the second history lesson, which is several years ago, I was with my family. We're talking, when I say several years ago, we're talking like 2012, okay? So kind of close to a decade ago, and it's kind of shocking and frightening to say that out loud. Nevertheless, I was walking around half-price books, and I got to the graphic novel section, and I was looking through most of the stuff that, normally catches my eye. A lot of DC comics, a fair number of Dark Horse comics, and then something happened. I stumbled across a book, and I looked at the cover, and there was 2 people on the front of it, and I had a moment where I went, hey, I recognize you. Now, of course, it's arrogance to suggest that I actually recognized Bruce Bechdel. I never met Bruce Bechdel. I never will, because Bruce Bechdel has actually passed away, supposedly by suicide. But it's important to note, looking at the cover of Fun Home that day, I noticed the way Bruce sat with his legs crossed, arm kind of leaning down and kind of looking off into space. And when I say I recognized it because I did that. And I still do that to this day. If I'm sitting in a room with people, I'll usually wind up crossing my legs, kind of leaning to one side. And I've always done that. So much so to the point that I still remember being, a little boy and having other boys picking on me going, you sit like a girl. Well, sirs, I apparently sit like a grown-ass man. Screaming queen, but a grown-ass man nonetheless. Nevertheless, what's important here is that I recognize something in Bruce's outward behavior, and so without missing a beat, I picked up Fun Home. I took it home. I read it. And it was because of this book that I really was able to finally reconcile the fact that I'm queer. I thought originally that my queerness was just a kind of heteroflexibility, meaning that I'm 99% straight, but open to maybe casual attraction to men. And then I did a lot of reading, a fair amount of experimenting, and I realized, no, I'm pansexual because I like men, I like women, I like everybody in between. And it's important to note, again, it was because of reading Fun Home, for me, that I was able to finally just be myself. Now, this is a really long intro to Fun Home, but this is a very shortened and condensed version of my ongoing story of why Fun Home means so much to me personally. And ever since I've started up this channel, every single time I do a new video, no matter how happy I am with the end result, I always end with the thought of, well, you still haven't done Fun Home. To which case I go, shut up, okay? Shut up. I just did every single chapter of Understanding Comics. Get off my back. Well, I'm done, okay? You know what? It's 2. It's finally time to do Fun Home. But I can't, for the life of me, even consider doing one video over Fun Home. So this long intro is really important for me so that I can convey to you that this is not going to be the first video or the only video about Fun Home. I want to sit down and go chapter by chapter through the book, finding just a small number of examples and just trying to analyze them, again, from a formalist perspective and explain why Fun Home is such a really amazing graphic novel and why it warrants so much attention and just admiration from so many people, but more than anything else, from me. I love Fun Home. It's such an amazing book, and I've spent 7 minutes now talking about it. I haven't even talked about it yet. So, again, this long intro is really just my way of trying to convey to you how much this book means to me and the fact that I've been doing this video or doing these videos for a year and always going, I want to do Fun Home. I feel like I'm finally ready to do Fun Home. So, into the breach, let's sit down and cover just the first chapter of Fun Home, a family tragic comic by Allison Bechdel, and try to understand what exactly she's doing with the book itself. Whew. Okay, so, we're not going to get into the book. Well, actually, we are. So, I kind of just realized as soon as I finished recording that opening introduction section that, I feel it's important to provide a kind of general summary. And I know I don't really want to do that anymore because I'm not interested so much in the narrative elements of books as just the formal elements, but especially with something like Fun Home when there's so many voices talking about it and when there's literally a musical based off of this book now, it seems more important than ever to give like newcomers to the book some general understanding of like what exactly it's about. Well, first off the bat, you'll note the book is entitled A Family Tragic Comic. Fun Home is more or less a memoir by Allison Bechdel, written about the time, I believe, of her late 20s, early 30s. You can get a little bit more information about it in this book here, again, The Secret to Superhuman Strength, and then also this other book by Allison Bechdel that I really want to talk to guys about at some point in the future too, which is Are You My Mother? Both of these books are also memoirs, like Fun Home, but they take place after her time writing this book. These stories are more about her sort of contemporary existence, whereas Fun Home is about her childhood, and then basically her early 20s. But at the same time, as much as it's about her kind of growing up and kind of wakening up to her sexuality, it's also about the suicide of her father, Bruce. Now, Bruce jumped in front of an 18-wheeler, specifically a Sunbeam bread truck. And it's important to note that, as she points out in the book, we're not entirely sure, and of course, oh yeah, I forgot the first chapter doesn't actually, the first chapter doesn't actually point that part out. But what's important is that Bruce's suicide is set in relation to the fact that Allison discovers from her mother after she herself comes out. Her mother conveys that her father had been a closeted homosexual and had been carrying on affairs with other men, and particularly young men who had been his students in high school. And so, at this moment, you have a young woman, and I love the metallic cover of this book so much, but I'll probably just have to jump now back to my hardback, which is what I'll be using for the remainder of this video anyway. But we have, at this moment, a woman who's trying to reconcile or accept her own sexuality while also trying to come to some sort of conclusion or just personal closure with the fact that her father was most likely gay, or at the very least some manner of bisexual or queer. And so you have, at this moment, a woman whose coming out coincided at the same time that her father's quasi-coming out occurred, followed immediately by his suicide. So the remainder of the book is her just trying to understand what was her childhood like, what was her early teens like, and how exactly was her family dynamic, and how exactly did she manage to survive an incredibly emotionally and physically abusive father who was struggling internally with the same kind of struggles that she was, only from a different generational and societal perspective. Now, that is an incredibly simplified version of what Fun Home is about. This book, again, it's a memoir. It's her story, but at the same time, her father plays such a significant role in it because her coming out coincides effectively with the implosion of her parents' marriage as well as her father's suicide. And so you see here a kind of really difficult dynamic of, finally, I'm a lesbian, I'm gay, I'm who I am. And apparently my dad is gay and always was, and now my parents are getting a divorce, and now my father is dead. Ow. That made my brain hurt. But all of those dynamics are important because they are all part of this narrative that she's trying to deliver to the reader. And what's really important as I now jump into the actual text itself is she breaks the book up into about 7 chapters. And if you take a moment to read the titles of each individual chapter, it's important to know that each of these are lines or else titles of various literary works. That is going to be the key to understanding a lot of the formative elements of Fun Home and how it's working in this book. So be kind of paying attention to those elements, and I'll talk about them a little bit too. But as we're looking at Fun Home, it's important to note this is a memoir, it's a biography, but it's also very much a journal of Allison Bechdel's thoughts, feelings, and moods, and her trying to just kind of find some functioning narrative out of what is arguably one of the most chaotic and emotionally devastating moments in her life, when it should be one of the most beautiful moments of her life. Okay, so the overall narrative of Fun Home is established. Let's now dig in a little bit to the first chapter, Old Father, Old Artificer, and figure out what exactly she's doing formally in just this first chapter. Alright, so I've talked now a little bit about why Fun Home was important to me as an individual. I've discussed a little bit why, or a little bit narratively, what exactly is going to be the meat of the story of Fun Home itself. But now we need to actually get into the very first chapter of the book. And I'm just going to show this off real quick. If you manage to track down a hardcover copy of this book like I did, you'll observe a really beautiful outer facade, which is actually going to be a panel from the book itself. But we'll get to that at a later point. The first chapter of Fun Home is titled Old Father, Old Artificer. This is a line from James Joyce's novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Now, if you've never read any James Joyce in your life, if you've never even heard of James Joyce, if you don't give a crap about James Joyce, don't worry. I'm not going to sit down and lecture you about James Joyce because I've read James Joyce. Oh boy. What's important is Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man was really his first novel, and it's largely a biographical novel. It's about this young man by the name of Stephen Dedalus, who's born in Ireland and raised there, and wants to become an artist. He wants to become a writer, and it's about his formative experience growing up. It literally opens with him being born and then going up through his life up to about his early to late teens when he kind of comes into his own. Again, Allison Bechdel is continually, throughout this book, using literature and philosophy as a way to kind of understand formative elements in her life. You'll also note each of these chapters is going to be opened up with a reproduction of an actual family photograph. If you actually Google Bruce Bechdel, you'll be able to find this particular photograph. It's a really great likeness, and it's a reminder again that Allison Bechdel is just a great artist, period. But what is then the tone in this first chapter? Basically, it's the portrait of the artist as a young man, except in this case, as a young woman. It's going to follow her early formative years as a child and what exactly her home life was like. And the first chapter is largely a way to kind of observe the dynamic between herself and her father. It literally opens up, of course, sort of acknowledging the fact that her father was going to die and begins with what was known, as she says here, as an Icaran game. Now, anybody who has kids, and I can't say anything here because I've never had kids and I never will, but I have friends who have kids, and so I experience them secondhand, and I know they have endless energy and they love their parents. I don't know why, but, you know, it's that thing that people do. They love each other. Okay. But it starts off with Allison wanting to just play, you know, airplane with her dad. Basically, her dad puts his feet under her tummy, lifts her up, holds her up in the air, and it's good. And then, eventually, as it happens, she falls down. Now, formally, she's already done a lot. Because at the same time that you see just those 3 nicely executed panels, you also get her internal monologue, which is kind of this sort of omniscient third-person narrator, which I'll talk about here in a second. But if you look at the passage, it says, "Like many fathers, mine could occasionally prevailed on for a spot of airplane. As he launched me, my full weight would fall on the pivot point between his feet and my stomach," to which she says, "Oof." And then follows that with, "It was a discomfort well worth the rare physical contact and certainly worth the moment of perfect balance when I soared above him. In the circus, acrobatics, where one person lies on the floor balancing another, are called Icaran games." She follows that up on the next page with, "Considering the fate of Icarus after he flouted his father's advice and flew so close to the sun his wings melted, perhaps some dark humor is intended. If you start to hear barks and huffs, it's because something happened outside and my dogs are freaking out. In our particular reenactment of this mythic relationship, it was not me, but my father who was to plummet from the sky." So, in just about 4 panels, she's basically set up the kind of narrative tone of the book. Not just in terms of the actual content of the narration, but then also using the medium of comics itself to really set about the tone of this story. Because again, we start off with Bruce on the floor, lifting his daughter up into the air, holding her above him for a few moments, and then ultimately dropping her, before then immediately telling her that the rug is filthy and that she needs to go get the tack hammer so that he can fix the wall molding. What we eventually begin to observe about Bruce is that I don't want to go so far as to suggest that he was a sadist, because I really don't believe that he was. As Allison points out, what's important about Bruce Bechdel is that he was a man who had a very definitive vision of what he wanted the world around him to be, what he wanted his home to be like. And as she demonstrates his ability to, say, take random bits of trash and turn it into effective furniture, the way he could completely remake a room by just moving some furniture, and also the way that he was kind of completely oblivious to his daughter's desire in regards to how she wanted her personal room decorated. Again, he seems apathetic. It's all about him. So what's important formally about this opening book is that it doesn't come across a narrative in the sort of traditional sense that we've seen in some of the comics I've talked about in this channel. This early opening chapter, and in fact, most of Allison Bechdel's works are largely her thoughts, her narration. She's delivering the sort of overall impression, her impression of who her father was, what was his behavior, what was basically like the reality of living with him. And then as you can kind of observe from the way the figures move about within these panels themselves, she allows a few sort of moments of personal affectation or just general anecdote to enhance the actual writing taking place above the panels. So in a way, you're not getting necessarily a narrative in the sense of we're going to get some characters and they're going to exchange bits of dialogues back and forth. We will get some of that in the book, but the experience of Fun Home far more is kind of about watching Allison's life through her eyes, and then at the same time recognizing that we're kind of watching her analyzing her life. And this is one of the hardest parts about Allison Bechdel books, is because they're very cerebral. If you take a look here at the same page, she notes historical restoration wasn't his job, it was his passion. I mean passion in every sense of the word, libidinal, manic, and martyred. So being a house restorer wasn't his job. That's the word that we get in that little dialogue box right there. And then in this long horizontal panel, we see him reading an architectural magazine, but then the implication is he's teaching high school English. And also, you know, we get a couple of, let's see, what was it? Oh yeah, 12th grade English. It's right there, sorry. Her monologue is right here. She says 12th grade English right there. And then we get this really nice long shot with Bruce and his students. But then right here, again, it was his passion. Martyred and passion are really important because it throws back to passion plays. Now, if you have absolutely no idea what a passion play is, actually, hold on just one second. Sorry, my cat is kind of being a giant butthead. Anyway, if you have no idea what a passion play is, they were plays largely sort of executed in Europe during, we'll say, kind of pre-Renaissance period that were largely designed to educate common average everyday people about the crucifixion. And so at this moment, martyred, while also sort of holding this long forebeam over his shoulder mimicking Christ, is a really well executed moment. And one of countless examples throughout Fun Home where Allison Bechdel is executing these sort of small interpanel victories. So when I say that the arrangement of the panels in this book is important, I know I say that about every video, but with Fun Home, you really have to pay attention because there's tons of little elements on it. Probably one of the best examples in this first chapter is this page here. Now, this page has been used in several academic papers that I've read about Fun Home, because I read this book again when I was in college, and I loved it, and I took every opportunity I could in college to write about this book and download academic articles about this book and just talk to my friends endlessly about this book to the point they're like, okay, we get it, Jammer, shut the fuck up. They didn't actually say that. Okay, well, they did say that, but they said it with love. What's important about this page, though, too, is it sort of continues what I was just talking about in the previous panel. Right off the bat, you see she's really good at breaking the panel up into these little bite-sized pieces here. Now, in this page, she's sort of using the examples of how she and her father were kind of like almost magnetic poles of one another, or just basically a binary of one another. So you'll see this one right here, she says Spartan to his Athenian, I was modern to his Victorian, what does she say on that one? Butch to his Nelly, and then utilitarian to his aesthete. In each one of these, she looks at, or she places Bruce's reaction to her behavior, she places her reaction to Bruce's behavior, and vice versa. They are sort of constantly at odds with one another. But if you really look here, in this panel particularly, there's something really well executed, I think, about this passage, or about this panel, because you'll see in Bruce's hand is a book titled The Nude. Now, right here, she says, I was Spartan to his Athenian. If you just look at this page, Spartan is meant in this instance to be very militaristic, very gung-ho and butch. Anybody who's seen 300 probably has at least a very skewed, but a very general idea that Spartans were a very militaristic society of people, whereas the Athenians were people like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, or Socrates. And so you see at that moment then, in this panel, Allison was somebody who, I'm not going to say was very militaristic, but was very butch. She wanted to play with guns and pretend she was a soldier, whereas her father was engaged in more kind of intellectual pursuits. But there's another little subtle aspect of it too, because in this opening passage, she's sort of constantly alluding before finally announcing that her father was gay. Now, again, it's important to note we don't know what Bruce's sexuality actually was. He did marry a woman, he did sire several children with him, but most of his affairs, in fact, all of the extramarital affairs that he had, or at least the ones that Allison and her family are aware of, were with men. So, for all we know, he could have been bisexual in some form or capacity. Moving forward, I'm probably just going to use the phrase queer. And I recognize that for some people, they're not going to like that, because queer means a great many different things to a great number of different people. I'm using it here right now because I'm not Bruce, I'll never be Bruce, and I'll never know how Bruce would have identified. So, Bruce is a queer man, but he's an educated queer man, and he seems to be reading a book about the nude. But also, there's a kind of double entendre in that book, because obviously, if you look at the cover of that book, it's a male torso. And so you see she's kind of presenting a kind of masculine performance while he is engaged in a kind of leering or sort of sensual study of the male form. At least, that's what it looks like on the surface. But if you've ever actually read that book, The Nude by Kenneth Clark, or if you say, happen to have The Nude by Kenneth Clark, and yes, before you say anything, I did buy this book because of Fun Home, and yes, I did go out of my way to purchase the paperback copy that looked exactly like Fun Home so I could show off to my friends. I am a nerd. Come on, y'all. Like, come on. It's me. But it's important to note that The Nude by Kenneth Clark is not a salacious book of a bunch of pictures of naked men, okay? If you want something like that, purchase The Male Nude by Toshin. It's a wonderful book. And yes, I have a copy. The Nude by Kenneth Clark is not just, like I said, a bunch of random pictures of naked men. It's also a study of what role the nude human body has played in terms of the history of art and human civilization. So again, what's fun is she's sort of constantly playing in this book about the difference between surface and deeper meaning. Because on the surface, it seems, oh look, Bruce is reading a book about naked men. Shocker. But he's also reading a very academic text about nudity in its relation to artistic works. And so at this moment, again, the thing about Bruce Bechdel is, on the surface, he seems to be a very loving father, but in fact, he's not, because this is ultimately just an outer facade, as she points out here, to cover up the fact that he wasn't necessarily being honest with himself. Now, Allison does point out in this opening passage that her life, as she's presented it here, may come across as biased, but she did have a childhood, and her family was an actual functioning family. The problem is, if you look at this page here, this beautiful 3-page panel spread, the reality of her home life was kind of difficult. She compares her father to a minotaur, a violent action where he's throwing a glass which permanently damages the linoleum on the kitchen floor, created a kind of panic in the household. You never knew when Bruce was going to go off. But then here in these bottom pages, we see him reading a nighttime story to her and singing a song to her, as she's narrating to the reader that, you know, it was kind of hard because we never knew when he was going to fly off the handle. Now, let's look at this, though, formally, because she's talking about the sudden anger her father would have, as opposed to the sudden moments of kindness that would kind of sort of counterbalance it. If you look at it from far away, you can observe clearly this top panel here where he's throwing the glass is a bold, dramatic panel. You see the motion of his arms through these three little lines here. We see the motion of the glass as it comes down here and smashes against the floor. She's done a couple of bits of the actual glass itself, shattering into a dozen pieces, and then she's whitened out the area in order to convey the sort of kinetic energy of the glass just shattering. And then on top of that, she's taken half of the page to show Bruce throwing the glass and the rest of her family watching. But then, when it goes down to the moments of kindness, we get two smaller moments. It's Bruce with Allison in a sort of confined space of her bedroom, reading a sweet children's story, and then him in the dark singing a nighttime lullaby to her before she says, please don't turn off the hall lights. And so you have the larger act of sort of monstrosity and aggression that characterized a lot of her memory weighed against the softness of a lot of smaller moments with her father that are also really important to her. And so as we sort of look at what her childhood was like, it's really pretty well established in a previous page or a previous moment where Bruce is kind of yelling at her brother Christian before Christian's like, please don't hit me, runs from the house. Allison accidentally breaks something that belongs to her dad. And we get this 6-page spread here, where her father becomes a kind of looming presence approaching her. She flees the house, ultimately to return. And if we read that passage, or particularly, Allison's narration of it, that 6-page panel spread becomes really important. She says, indeed, the result of that scheme, a half-bull, half-man monster, inspired Daedalus's greatest creation yet. He hid the Minotaur in the labyrinth, a maze of passages and rooms opening endlessly into one another, and from which, as stray youths and maidens discovered to their peril, escape was impossible. Then there are those famous wings. Was Daedalus really stricken with grief when Icarus fell into the sea, or just disappointed by the design failure? So, you'll note here, on this page, she hops back into a 6-page spread, where on the previous panel, she had taken a moment to kind of spread out a little bit into this long vertical panel and then use 4 more panels to convey just the information of Bruce is yelling, Bruce is about to hit Christian, Christian runs, knocking her, she breaks the glass. So you'll see a little bit more play on this page here before she then hops back into a 6-page panel here. And I believe, honestly, if I can make a kind of argument here, this 6-panel layout, while being pretty basic, is really important to the narrative tone. Because again, she's conveying the notion of her inability to escape from the actual raw tension of her family. Her father appears to be this kind of menacing monster who is constantly threatening her and making her worry about being safe in her own home. And ultimately, that reveals a bigger problem of her life, which was that she can never really get away. And for people who have been the victims of familial abuse, they know that pain. It's hard to escape. And some people were like, why don't they leave? Where are you supposed to go? In the case of Allison and her brothers, that's their home. It may not be the most comfortable place, but it's what they know. And so when we look at, again, the notion of old father, old artificer, what's really sort of taking place in this moment is, or at least in this first chapter, is Allison's attempting to sort of show how the outer facade of her father as a teacher, as a man of the community, as a man who ran the funeral home that belonged to her family, as just her father, period. There seems to be a kind of outer veneer or facade of him being a loving father. But if you look closer to what was actually underneath all of the ornate decorations of her family home, she was living a daily trauma of existence. And so, using the classical figure of Daedalus, who, if you don't know who he is, I'll just briefly explain. He was a Greek architect, really popular in the myth of, I believe it was Perseus, but somebody in the comment section double check me on that one, who basically designed the labyrinth that held the Minotaur. Alison Bechdel is using the image of the Minotaur here as a kind of monster born from sexual monstrosity, again, sort of further developing the theme of Bruce being a closeted and frustrated human being. I love this book. As a way to kind of heighten the point that she found herself, like a lot of the victims of the Minotaur, basically trapped in a continual state of panic and fear and terror. And so, looking at that in terms of her childhood, it becomes really important to understand what is the role that my father played in terms of my personal development in life. Well, this is chapter 1, so we still have about 6 more chapters to really dig into that. But I'm already hitting 12 minutes on this little section, so I know I need to stop it pretty soon. Thank you for staying around this long. But what's important is, like, one of the last passages, or one of the last pages in the book, is where she talks a little bit about Bruce being gone, and how probably the thing that stung the most about Bruce's suicide was not necessarily that now
he was gone. Because when we talk about the idea of somebody being dead and gone, a lot of the real emotional pain is we can't be with that person anymore. We can't talk to them anymore. We can't hug them anymore. We can't feel their love anymore. And as she points out, probably one of the most problematic things was he was kind of already gone before he was even there. And so as we look at just the first chapter of Fun Home, Bechdel is using Joyce's notion of the portrait of the artist as a young man, watching the development of a child into early adulthood, in order to sort of lay the foundational bedrock of what we can expect in this book. Through this first chapter, Bruce appears to be just this monstrous human being, but also a very human being. Yeah, I think I pulled that off. But what's important here, again, is the way that formally she's laying a lot of bedrock down as well, to see that throughout this book, what seems to be on the surface is not everything that's actually taking place underneath it. Because on the surface, the Bechdel family home seems to be this sort of lavish mansion-esque home filled with like pretty furniture and fabrics and curtains, what have you. But then as we dig a little bit deeper into the home, we recognize that, unfortunately, it's also a place and space that's filled with a lot of tension and pain. Which, begging your pardon here, pretty much sounds like growing up. And so it's this formal aspect of constantly showing the reader small elements while also alluding to other facets, and also sort of playing with the arrangement of panels in order to convey these narrative elements, that Allison Bechdel is able to achieve most of this tone. Now, I've said enough right here, so let's do the last hurrah and then call it a day. All right. Fun Home, a family tragic comic, Chapter 1. Like I said, I have been wanting to do this book for ages, and so this is just the first and hopefully a long effort of covering this book chapter by chapter by chapter and trying to show you why Allison Bechdel is brilliant. Like, yeah, I've literally spent a half hour talking about it already. I don't know what else to say except just by looking at Chapter 1 and the execution. This book is amazing, and every single time I pick it up, I just love it. But I'm not going to gush too much in this last section here, because we've still got like 6 more chapters to go. So, keep your eye on the channel. Again, I'm going to try to do this chapter by chapter, but I'm also, as always, reading multiple books at the same time. So, the next video may be Chapter 2. It may be something else. I actually, just the other day, bought Dave McKean's latest graphic novel, so I hope to be covering that at some point in the future. And also, I still need to cover the rest of Signal to Noise. So, just keep your eye on the channel here, and I promise when the new chapters come out, I'll make sure to post them to YouTube. And with that, yeah. So, thank you for watching. Thank you for indulging me in this fun exercise. If you like the show, please like, share, and subscribe. All that claptrap. It lets me know that you like these videos and that you want to see more. In regards to Fun Home, this book has been put out by Hoffman Mifflin, so it's not anything like Fantagraphic Comics or something like Marvel or DC or something like that. No, this is going to be a more quote-unquote mainstream publisher. But nevertheless, I would definitely advise you to check out your local comic book shop and see if they've got, if not a hardback copy, then maybe at the very least a paperback copy. Because again, Fun Home is a pretty popular book, and a lot of people, including, lesbians who like to read, apparently, there are lesbians in the world and they like to read. Who knew? By the way, that was sarcasm, an attempted sarcasm. Lesbians out there, if you like my show, please keep watching because you're cool. There are people out here who love this book, so check your local comic book shop. Also, don't forget, check your local library, because a lot of libraries have comics these days, and a lot of them have graphic novel sections, and I guarantee you somebody out there has probably gone up to their librarian going, I'd like to read Fun Home, please. So, check your local library. If they don't have it, ask for an interlibrary loan form. They'll be happy to help you out. And as always, too, like I said at the start, there is a Patreon for the show. It's in the link tree in the description section below. Check it out. And then another thing. I have written not just papers for college, but also several essays and reviews of Fun Home for my old blog, White Tower Musings. I'll include a link to those essays in the description section below too. I mean, technically you can find it in the link tree just to my blog itself, but I'll post a link just to my Fun Home section because I think there was like 9 or 10 essays. Like I said, I'm a man obsessed, but again, this book is great, and Allison Bechdel is bae, and I will fight anybody who talks shit about her. So, in conclusion, thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.